Thank you for having us back with you again today. We always enjoy getting to come out and be with you, and enjoyed our time with some of you at the banquet that we had in Plainview a few months ago. And so I feel like we're getting to be a little bit more acquainted each time we get together and such. This morning I will be speaking to you out of the book of Genesis. So if you want to look in Genesis chapter 31 this morning. We went back to Perryton yesterday for a funeral, attended a funeral, and got to see some of the people that we had been with for over 20 years, and really enjoyed that. And one of the things in driving up there, I just got to thinking about the time we'd spent there and our kids, and I just remembered, you ever hear kids complain about it not being fair? You know, someone got a toy and they didn't get a toy, and it's just not fair why someone gets something. And I thought, you know, that happens in children's lives, but it never happens in the adult world, does it? No, it happens in the adult world. There's moments in lives where things just don't seem to be fair. And that's the title of my message this morning is, when you have fairness, how do you deal with it? So I want to offer you 3 tools for dealing with unfairness as we look at our text this morning. In 1933, there were some teenage young men, one in glasses, and they were very close together, and they began to put together a comic strip. And they began to develop this super hero, and they named him Superman. They wrote the script out for him, and they developed this character, but it didn't go anywhere. They wrote for a company, a comic strip company, and just didn't have a lot of success with this Superman superhero. So in 1938, they sold their rights to Superman. Now we know that it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. They went on to continue to write for the comic strip and made somewhat of a decent living out of it, but later years they began to misuse some of their funds and didn't fare out as well as the royalties of the Superman comic strip. One of the friends, Joe Shuster, decided that he would sue the company for some of the royalties of it, and he failed every time that he did that. So both he and his friend, Jerry Siegel, both died without receiving any royalties from Superman. Just doesn't seem fair, does it? They continued to write comic strips, even continued to develop the character, and they did all this for the character comic strip Superman, but never received any benefits to it. I think sometimes we all have some type of experience in life, whether it be a work experience, whether it be in a home experience, whether it be in a friend experience, somewhere, even in government, we see it today, things just aren't fair. The elections aren't fair, we say. When something doesn't come our way and we don't get what we want and how we deal with that, it is deemed unfair. And it causes a lot of distress. It causes a lot of frustration and confusion inside of us. Ball games end with that statement, well, they're not fair, the referees aren't fair, the team's not fair, they're not acting right, the call is not this way or that way. And so I think an unfairness is a very common emotion and feeling that we as human beings experience today. Several years ago, there was an experiment on fairness. And they took 2 Capuchin monkeys, little brown monkeys, and they put them in cages side by side, each one in its own cage. And so the monkey was to perform a task, and the monkey would take a rock from inside the cage and would give it to the scientist. And when the scientist would get the rock, then the scientist gave the first monkey a slice of cucumber. The monkey ate the cucumber and enjoyed the cucumber. The monkey next to it pulled out his rock and gave it to the scientist. The scientist then took a grape and gave it to the monkey. The first monkey, seeing what's going on, realized that he didn't get a grape like that monkey was. And so he thought he wanted a grape. So he goes and he gets his rock. He hands it through the hole of his cage and hands it to the scientist. And the scientist puts the rock down and reaches, and the monkey's watching to see if he reaches for the grape, but he reaches for the cucumber, hands it to the monkey. The monkey pulls it inside the cage, looks at it, sticks his hand back out the cage, and throws it at the scientist. It's not fair. The monkey then commences to jump on the cage and grabs hold and begins to shake it, screaming and hollering. Now, I don't speak monkey, but I think somewhere there's the words unfair. And so in their experiment, they begin to realize that there's this determination of fairness and unfairness. What is it? And so it's a bit of a challenge for them to understand what fairness is. And we are suffering through the same things in life as well. I was reading through the book of Genesis in the 31st chapter, and I'm reading the story of Jacob. Jacob is the son of Isaac. Isaac is the son of Abraham. Abraham is promised by God that he would have children that would outnumber the sands on the earth, that his ancestry would be so large. And so Isaac is a very key figure, and we know the story, if I might recall it just a little bit, but Isaac is born to Abraham and Sarah in their old age. Abraham takes Isaac, the son, the promise that God has, and offers him as a living sacrifice. But God withholds the hand of Abraham and spares Isaac, and he continues his promise through Isaac. Isaac has two children, two boys, Jacob and Esau, Esau being the oldest, and Esau has the birthright, the blessing of his father, which means he gets all the wealth and all these things that are to be given to him. But Jacob deceives Esau. Esau comes in from hunting and says, hey, I'm hungry. Or Jacob comes in and says, or Esau says, I'm hungry, and Jacob's he's a cooker, he's not a hunter. And so Esau says, Jacob says, I'll give you, if you'll sell me your birthright, I'll give you something to eat. And thus, Jacob gets the birthright. He goes into his father Isaac, whose eyesight is beginning to dwindle, and he deceives his father into getting the blessing that belongs to Esau. Rebekah, the wife of Isaac, realizes that this is going to cause problems in the family. And so she begs that Jacob would leave. And Isaac tells Jacob to go back to Haran, his home where Abraham came from. Go back up to that area, to family, and marry. And so Jacob goes, and he goes up to Laban, and he finds a beautiful young girl by the name of Rachel. And he falls in love with her. And he decides that he wants to marry her. So he says to Laban, he says, I want to marry your daughter Rachel. But Laban says, it's not right. This is not fair. How is it that I'm to give you my daughter, but you give me nothing in return? We hear that unfairness once again. And so Laban says, here, I'll tell you what I'll do. If you'll serve me for 7 years, I'll give you my daughter Rachel. So Jacob serves Laban, his uncle, for 7 years. It comes time for the wedding. And I'm sure she's veiled, whatever. And they come in, and the next morning, Jacob wakes up to see his new wife and finds out that it's not Rachel, but it's her older sister, Leah. He goes to Laban, says, hey, what's going on? I'm supposed to marry Rachel. And Laban says, wait a minute. He says, is it fair that the younger daughter marry before the older daughter? Thus, I gave you my oldest daughter first. And so Jacob says, all right, I want Rachel. And Laban says, all right, work for me another 7 years, and I'll give you Rachel. And so Jacob goes and serves Laban another 7 years, and then Rachel gets married to Jacob. And so Jacob is looking, and he has nothing. And Laban sees this, and he says, I tell you what, Jacob says, send me off, let me go home. But I have nothing. And Laban says, tell you what, stay a little longer, and I'll let you have some of the sheep that's there. What can I give you? to take with you, Laban says. And he said, and Jacob says, I want some of the spotted, the outcast of the sheep, the speckled ones, the mottled ones that aren't there. And Laban's thinking, this is a great deal because those are the ones I don't want. There's not many of them. So he takes those, has them separated, and sends them off to be taken care of somewhere. And Jacob continues to serve Laban in caring for his stock. Now God blesses Jacob. And everything that Jacob touches, it multiplies. So all of Laban's stock begins to multiply, and he's increasing in his wealth. We've attended the country of Lesotho in South Africa. And I learned that when you see sheep herders are out and they have sheep. And I asked one time, what do they do with the sheep? Do they get the wool? Do they eat them? They said, oh no. To have sheep is to have wealth. The more sheep that you have, the wealthier you are. So it's not about sheep for the sake of meat or the sake of wool, and certainly they will use that, but they have them according for wealth. When it comes time for a great wedding, they'll have a wedding feast, and the father will come and he will bring his sheep, and he will slaughter those sheep for that feast, indicating his wealth. The more sheep he brings to the feast, the more wealthy he is. And so this is the idea here, the same thing with Laban. All this is increasing his wealth with the number of sheep. And so Jacob has been increasing the livelihood of Laban. And so Jacob goes and he sees the sheep comes in. He takes a stick, he whittles it out and carves some of it down so the white of the stick is showing, kind of stripes on it. He lays it there in the ditch, in the trough of the water, and as they come and they begin to mate and so forth, they produce offspring that are spotted, that are mottled, that are striped, that fit that criteria that Laban agreed to, and they begin to grow in numbers. And Jacob becomes somewhat wealthy in this situation. Laban begins to see what's going on, and he says, no, wait a second. We've got to change the conditions. And so often, as Laban changed the conditions of the wives of Leah and Rachel, he changes the conditions here. You can have this and this and this. And so we can see in the life of Jacob that life just doesn't seem to be fair. Children say, well, it's not fair. What's a common response? Life is not fair is our counsel, isn't it? Well, the world isn't going to be fair to you because the world is like Laban, always going to seek to nurture itself more than it's going to seek to encourage you. Now, that's not God. God is always fair. He is equal in everything that he does and everything that he puts before you, and he has shown that through the life of Jacob. In verse 1, chapter 31 of Genesis, this is where the story comes, this point here. It says, Jacob heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob has taken away all that our fathers, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what belonged to our father, he has made all his wealth. So Jacob happens to hear the sons complaining. Look what's happened. There's an unfairness here. Jacob is taking everything that belongs to them. They're looking at their inheritance. We're supposed to get all this, but Jacob is getting it. He is beginning to grow his own wealth, and he's taking ours. And Jacob hears this, and in verse 2, Jacob saw the attitude of Laban, and behold, it was not friendly toward him as formerly. So he recognizes that Laban is doing the same thing. His attitude has changed. This is not the great loving nephew, but now this is one that's beginning to steal his wealth. And his attitude is changing towards Jacob. So in verse 3, then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. Hear this, and you'll hear it several times in other parts of Scriptures, but here also in our text this morning. God says, I will be with you. You see, when we are going through circumstances in life and they seem to be unfair, We need to find a confidence of knowing that God is with his faithful. God honors the obedience of his servants, and he is with them. Verse 4, so Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to his flock in the field and said to them, I see your father's attitude that is not friendly toward me as formerly, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength. Yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. However, God did not allow him to hurt me. If he spoke this, the speckled shall be your wages, then all the flock brought forth speckled. And if he spoke thus, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock brought forth were striped. Thus God has taken away your father's livestock and given them to me. And it came about at the time when the flock were mating that I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the male goats which were mating were striped, speckled, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am. As I read this text, verse 12 jumped out at me, and it brought me some comfort, and I pray that it brings you comfort too. Verse 11, then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am. And he said, lift up now your eyes and see that all the male goats which are mating are striped, speckled, and mottled. God had done this, and he's reminding Jacob this. He's letting Jacob know, I'm the one that has given you these by this feature. But listen to the rest of it. For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. When we go through life circumstances, through situations that we find that we want to cry out, unfair, unfair, we need to have it within our heart and knowledge and knowing that God is saying, listen, I've seen how you've been treated. I know how that you are being treated. I know what's going on there. I've seen this situation. And I will bless you, and the blessings will come from me, and I will encourage you and strengthen you because I am with you, and I will be with you. In verse 13, God continues to speak. He says, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, where you made a vow to me. Now arise and leave this land and return to the land of your birth. As Jacob is making his journey, he comes to this place at Bethel, and he experiences an encounter with God. And there he builds an altar, and it's a place of worship. And God told Jacob, he says, you go and up here and get your wife and so forth, but you are to return home back to Bethel. And he's reminding him now again, here, it is time to leave. You've been in unfair circumstances for like 20 years, but it's time to go home. I'm calling you home. Go back to Bethel. And so Jacob is sharing this with his wives. He's retelling the story. We read it earlier in an earlier text here, but he's retelling it. There's something about this retelling it that brings it alive. But he's bringing Rachel and he's bringing Leah alongside of it, understanding, so they understand why they're going back. And so he's sharing this with them. In verse 14, Rachel and Leah said to him, do we still have any portion or inheritance in our father's house? We hear what you're saying, Jacob. We hear your complaint. We hear the unfairness. We experience the same unfairness too. Do we have that inheritance? We don't. In other words, Jacob, God has blessed you, and he's calling you home, and we're going to go home with you. We're okay with this, Jacob. We're all right with it. Verse 15, are we not reckoned by him as foreigners? Has he not treated us the same way? For he has sold us and has also entirely consumed our purchase price. There again, look what Laban's done to them. Here he is, their father, and he's given them off, but yet they recognize he's consumed their complete price of who they were. He sold them out as in slaves. And then verse 16, surely all the wealth which God has taken away from our father belongs to us and our children. Now then, do whatever God has said to you. Jacob lived through some very difficult circumstances here. And by all rights of our understanding and definition of unfairness, he was right to say so. Looking at the definition of unfairness, basically it is a principle of trying to find equality. If I give someone over here $2, then the equality is I have to give everyone on this side $2. If I give this side over here $2 and I give this side $1, that's not equal. Thus, it is not fair. Now, fairness comes from your perspective, but not necessarily from God's perspective. We'll see as we close the message this morning, God's perspective is He determines the fairness. But that's what we look at. We look at it, see how other people are dealing with it and how they're handling that. So I want to offer you some tools that if you're in a certain situation or if you're in some circumstances that you would deem unfair, that you find yourself being mistreated or unfairly treated, what are some tools that might help you in dealing with the unfairness of your situation? First of all, we look at the life of Jacob. And we find in Jacob is this. As he deals with his unfairness, God says, go back to Bethel. Do you remember your promise? You promised that you would come back here and you'd make me your God and you'd worship me. You set an altar and a place of worship there. The first tool is this. When your circumstances seem to be unfair, use your mind to search the past for a commitment or commitments to God. When you're in that situation and it just seems like someone's not treating you right, you're not getting the same pay as others, you're not getting the pay that you expect, you're not getting the crop that you deserve, you're not getting this. I have a good friend, and every time I see him, I'll say, how are you doing? He says, better than I deserve. And I'll tell him, you don't deserve a lot. No. But we think we deserve a lot, and sweet, when we don't get that, we feel that we're unfair. And so for Jacob, what he did, God says, here, go back to Bethel. Remember? So if I'm facing an unfair situation, what can I do? First of all, what I can do is I can take my mind and I can rehearse the history of my life, the events of my life, and to search what were the commitments that I made to God. You see, it might be that those circumstances that you're living are there to encourage you to rediscover your commitment to God. Jacob set an altar at Bethel, but he spent 20 years over here. And God says, now, do you remember where you're supposed to be? Jacob could have very easily said, now, Laban, look, I've got my wealth here, you've got your wealth, why don't we live here and we can get along and we'll stay together, the grandkids can play, you can see the grandkids on a regular basis, you don't have to worry about them being a whole nation away. He could have said, look, everything is fine, everything's producing good, I'm comfortable to stay where I'm at, but he didn't. God says, listen, there is an uncomfortableness about your circumstances that's causing you to question whether you should stay. And that causing that question whether you should stay is calling you and encouraging you to remember, what has God called you to do? He's reminded to remember to return to the land of his fathers, to the land of his birth, to Canaan. Genesis chapter 28 verse 15 says, behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. He had told Jacob, I will bring you back to this land. 28 verses 19, he says he called the name of the place Bethel. And Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take, he will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I will return to my father's house in safety. Then the Lord will be my God. He remembers where God is going, where he is, what God has called him. In chapter 32 of Genesis, we find that Jacob begins to make his way back. And he's about to meet his brother Esau. And remember, he stole the birthright of Esau, and Esau had vowed that he would take the life of Jacob if he ever saw him again. So here comes Jacob, and he's bringing all of his wealth. He breaks it up into companies and sends them ahead, and he stays back and he prays and says, hey, I'm going to go up there, but God, if you'll take care of me, I'm going back to where you've called me. He said, O God of my father Abraham, God of father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you. God said, I will prosper you. Here we find Jacob takes that promise, that calling of come back to your birth home and I will be with you. He begins to understand that means more than just simply I will be present with you, but I will be good to you and I will bring prosperity to your life. And Jacob goes and he meets his brother Esau, and all is well. He remembers this prior to his meeting with Esau. Think for just a moment, your mind. Is there some previous commitments you've made to God that need to be reminded in your heart and your life, that maybe you need to revisit and think, I need to go back there. My circumstances have brought me to a situation of an unfairness. Maybe God is calling me back to something. For Jacob, it was very specific to go back to Bethel. But for you and I, it may be as simple as something of just simply going back to the Sermon on the Mount, of being kingdom people. In a life-working situation, people may not be treating me fairly, but I made a commitment to live like Christ in the midst of a working place. I made a commitment to live like Christ in an un-Christ-like world. The world is not seeking to elevate me. The world is seeking to elevate itself. Thus, it will never be fair from that perspective. Our circumstances may have us crying unfair treatment. But are we really just wanting others to give their best, when we should be remembering that we were promised God we would give our best? We said to God, God, I will be the best servant of the Lord in this situation. But now I'm complaining that I'm being mistreated. Are we expecting the attitudes of others to change, or are we ready to change our attitude? Laban's attitude had changed against Jacob, and he recognized it. But for Jacob, he needed to stay, and he did stay faithful to God. He continued with those wages being changed. But God took those circumstances and he began to make something out of it, and he began to prosper in the life of Jacob. Use your mind to search your life and to find those moments of commitment to God, whether it be just simply a commitment, kind of like our New Year's resolutions. My resolution is this year I'm going to be kinder to people. Maybe that's one of those callings God has in your life, is to be more forgiving, to be more loving, to withhold the tongue more, to be more Christ-like. Whatever it is, search your mind. When your circumstances appear to be unfair, the second tool is your arms. Use your arms to embrace God as he uses your circumstances to prosper in your life. We look at Jacob here, and we find that he began to embrace his circumstances. God says, here's the promise, here's the call, here's the calling I had to come back. And so he began to set forth, and Scripture doesn't say that God told Jacob to take this stick and to carve it up and to lay it down. But Jacob does it. And he begins to take that, and God takes those circumstances, and he began to build the wealth. He began to prosper in the life of Jacob. He now has 2 wives. He's having children. He's got all this livestock that he has, and he's accumulating his wealth. And it's more than what he and Laban can live in the same area together. Use your arms to embrace God as he uses your circumstances. In other words, my circumstances aren't fair, and they're not comfortable, and I would do anything to get out of them. But it's in that moment that we hear God say, I have seen your circumstances. I have seen how you've been treated, how you are being treated, and your faithfulness with me will assure my presence with you. I will be with you. How do you embrace God when you cannot see the benefits of your circumstances? I think as Jacob is doing all this, he's not doing this out of his selfish desire. If I put this stick out, that'll make this happen and I'll get all this. I think he was just obeying God in that moment. And then later he realizes, wow, look what I have. It's time to go. Look what God has done. He says to Leah and Rachel, here's what's happened. He's given me these spotted and speckled and mottled animals and so forth. This is who they are. They're ours. God did this, not me. But God used these circumstances, and I have what I have because of it. How do we embrace with our arms? First of all, be more sensitive to the leading of the Holy Spirit than you're sensitive to the oppression against you. We spend more time complaining about the unfairness of our situation than we do in prayer. With our arms reaching up to embrace God and say, God, I need to embrace you, rather than trying to embrace the situation. Rather than trying to find a way out of it, rather to find God in it. Jacob was in the right place at the right time when he heard Laban's brother speaking and complaining. I don't think he was spying and looking, well, what are they saying? But I think God set him right there to hear it so he would know that things are taking place in his circumstances. He could have tried to stick it out, to weather it out. He could have stayed, but he chose to listen to the Holy Spirit. He began to listen to God in the dream. He could have very easily just gone to Laban and says, hey, Laban, let's straighten this out. Let's get this worked out. There's complaints here, and I want to take it to HR, Human Resources. But he doesn't. He listens. He's more sensitive to the speaking of the Holy Spirit than he's complaining about his unfair treatment. How do you embrace with your arms? Be prepared to experience the goodness of God, though it may be in long coming. You know, we ask God, would you do something for us? And we expect it then. My grandkids are that way. They want something, they want it right then. You know, I want this. No, let's wait till we get there. I want an ice cream. Well, we're like 20 miles from town. Can you wait till we get? No, I want it now. And so we go through the logic. Where are we going to get it? Where are we going to get this ice cream? And they still don't get it. I want it now. And that's how we are sometimes in life. God, I want the blessing now. And sometimes we just need to wait and be patient, to be prepared that his promise will be fulfilled. That's what I try to help my kids to understand is this. Listen, we will get it if you'll just get through this time. When we get to town, we'll get the ice cream. Be prepared to experience the goodness of God, though it may be long in coming. He said in verse 3, God did, I will be with you. Genesis chapter 50, at the death of Jacob, you know, his son Joseph is sold off into captivity. And Jacob and all of his sons and all of his wealth moved down to Egypt, and they come down there, and finally Jacob dies, and he has longed to see his son Joseph. But Genesis chapter 50, verse 20 says, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result. Joseph states God's promise to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob now is fulfilled in this moment at Jacob's death. It's a long time that they've lived through these circumstances, but God is faithful and just to be at the end. Jacob understands that this I will be with you is that sense of God being good to him. I will be with you. Be prepared. And then how do you embrace with your arms? By seeing God's hand at work, and that it is stronger than the hearing of the world's words. We need to see God at work in our circumstances. Jacob said, see everything here, Leah, Rachel? God made these sheep the way they are. We need to see God's hand in our circumstances more than we listen to the world's words against us in our situation. And then also we can do it by sharing your trust in God. I think it's interesting that he brought his wives together and he says, listen, here's what's going on. He wanted to bring them on page with them and said, here, I want you to be a part. I want you to know what's going on so that they would embrace it too. Share your trust in God that those close to you, that they may be a part of God's working in your life. We kind of want to keep that quiet sometimes. But we need to share our faith with one another. So here's what God is doing so that you can be a part of it. Jacob didn't say to Rachel and Leah, hey, pack your bags, we're moving out of here. And they said, well, where are we going? It doesn't matter, just follow me. He said, no, let me tell you why we're moving. Because you need to see the hand of God. Share your trust in God. When your circumstances appear to be unfair, use your heart, the tool of your heart, to trust that God is working his kingdom in your life. You see what I'm doing with unfairness? It's unfair because I'm not being treated. But the fairness comes in is that in that unfair treatment of the world, God is treating you fairly, impartially, with the fullness of his love, the fullness of his character. God's purpose in your life is more assured than the expected outcome of your circumstances. Oh, that one monkey could say, if I could just have that grape, everything would be fine. But the scientist has a whole other purpose. Perhaps that cucumber has something specific of need to that monkey besides just being an experiment. God has a purpose. For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. You see, fairness is often described from our own perspective. I was not treated the way that I think that I should be treated. The world makes promises, and we expect those promises to be honored. But what we need to realize is the world is deceitful, and such promises are not always fulfilled. We may be expected to be treated as we would treat others and declare that unfair. They didn't treat me kind, but I was kind to them. I hear that a lot. Well, I'll say to someone here, you need to treat someone this way. Well, they didn't treat me that way. Use your mind and recall what God's called you to do. He didn't call you to be treated by others in a fair way. He called you to treat others fairly. Love thy neighbor as thyself. The greatest of these commandments is that you love one another. You will be known by your love for one another. Forgive one another. These are the traits and characteristics. Fairness is the feeling of not getting what I think I deserve. Thus we feel treated unfairly. You see, God is faithful with his promises and fairness, and that he gives to each of us equally of his life. Our circumstances may be there to help us understand the fairness of God. You see, fairness on the positive side comes from the giver, who stipulates the conditions of the situation. Fairness on the negative side falls upon the receiver when he or she evaluates the circumstances with selfish desire. Now, real quickly, I'll just close with this illustration here. We look in Matthew and we see where the landowner comes and he says, he sees people standing. He says, why are you not working? He said, we have nothing. He said, well, here, go to work and I will pay you a day's wages. I'll pay you a denarii if you'll work all day. He comes about 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock and late in the evening, later in that evening, he finds someone. He says, why are you not working? He said, well, we have nothing. He said, well, here, I'll pay you a denarii if you'll work. And he works just a couple of hours. It comes time to pay, and he pays the ones that came that morning, gives them 1 denarii, and the ones that came last, gave them a denarii, and they begin to complain, wait a minute, this is not fair. You're paying them the same amount for the least amount of work. And Jesus says, but the owner says, but did I not agree to you that I would pay you this price? You see, fairness on the positive side is when it comes from the giver and there's that establishment of agreement. God says, I will give you this. Well, it's just not fair. I've been a Christian all my life, and now all of a sudden on their deathbed, they've lived all this sinful world, all this joyful, fun things in life, and now they're saved and they get to go to heaven and experience. That's not fair. God says, I determine fairness. The negative side of unfairness is when, or fairness is whenever I say, wait a minute, I didn't get what I deserved. We're not looking at God then, we're looking at self. Use your mind to embrace with your arms the commitment of your heart's trust in God, whatever the circumstances. Trust in the Lord. Perhaps you're facing some circumstances that you might deem to be unfair. How do you deal with that? You can go home and you can complain about it. You can try to confront it and change it. But I think we find from Jacob these three tools is it gives me the opportunity to examine what God has called me to do. And that I can embrace those circumstances and see and anticipate what God is doing. And then with my heart, I can trust that He's on the other side. We've often heard that Jesus is in the middle of the storm with us. Whenever Jesus got out of the boat and stood there, God's with us in the storm. But sometimes we fail to realize God carries us through the storms, and He's on the other side of the storm as well. He's on the other side of your circumstances while working your circumstances to prosper His kingdom in you. What will you do when you cry out to God in your prayer time? God, I'm not treated fairly. What are you going to do? Remember God's calling. Embrace His presence in your circumstances and wait and see what God has in store for you. Would you pray with me? Father, I pray that you bless us this morning, Lord. Perhaps there is a need for some of us this morning just to bow before you and say, God, I need to put my situation in your hands and I need to trust you. That, Father, that you see me, that you see my situation. And, Lord, I need not speak to anyone, but, Father, I can bear it before you and know that you will carry me through those circumstances, through those situations. And that, Father, you will bring me to where you have called me. Wherever that may be, Father, that I might serve you. I pray, Father, you speak to our hearts this morning, Lord. And, Father, perhaps if there's something that anyone needs to do, that, Lord, they would lay before you this issue. And, God, you would give care and you'd give comfort. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.